The night wrapped the city in a cold, restless rain, the kind that soaked into bones and made even strong people feel small. And as the millionaire's car moved through the nearly empty road, his mind was far away from compassion, tangled instead in numbers, contracts, and a board meeting that had drained him of patience and faith in people. The glow of the headlights suddenly caught a shape at the edge of the asphalt, and instinctively his foot eased off the accelerator before his mind fully understood why. A woman stood there, slightly hunched, her thin coat useless against the downpour, and in her arms were four tiny shapes pressed close together, wrapped in uneven blankets that looked as though they had been collected from different places in a hurry. Quadruplets. The word struck him with a strange force, and for a moment he wondered if exhaustion was playing tricks on his eyes. A horn blared behind him, sharp and angry, but he ignored it, pulling over despite the voice in his head that warned him of danger, inconvenience, liability. When he stepped out of the car, the rain hit his face hard, cold droplets sliding down his collar, but what truly stopped him was the way the woman reacted. She turned instantly, positioning her body as a shield, her eyes wide with fear that went beyond simple caution, fear learned through repetition. Before she could speak or run, before the moment could shatter, he heard himself say, quietly but firmly, "I will not harm you." The words hung between them, fragile and untested, and he realized how absurd they might sound coming from a stranger in an expensive car at the side of a dark road. She said nothing, only tightened her grip on the babies, and he noticed how her arms trembled, not just from the cold, but from a fatigue that seemed to reach deep into her spirit. He lifted his hands slightly, palms open, a gesture he had not used since childhood, and took a careful step back to give her space, aware that every movement mattered. The rain blurred her features, but he could see the marks of sleepless nights on her face, the stubborn set of her jaw that suggested she had been fighting far longer than this single evening. Cars passed without slowing, water spraying, lives rushing on as if this small human crisis did not exist, and something inside him tightened at the indifference of it all. He offered his coat, extending it slowly, letting it hang from his fingers so she could take it without coming closer. She hesitated, eyes flicking from his face to the car and back again, calculating risks the way only someone with everything to lose can. When she finally accepted it, her fingers brushed his, ice cold, and the contact sent a shock through him that had nothing to do with temperature. He asked her name, keeping his voice low, and she answered after a pause, "Elena," as if even giving that much could be dangerous. The babies made small, weak sounds, and he realized with a jolt that they were not crying because they had learned that crying did not always bring help. He asked where she was going, and she shook her head, a tiny, broken motion that said there was no destination, only forward. She told him the shelter was full, that the buses had stopped running, that she had been walking for hours because standing still felt worse than moving. He did not tell her his name, did not mention wealth or power, only said that his car was warm, that there were towels in the back, and that leaving her here felt wrong in a way he could not ignore. The silence that followed stretched long and heavy, the rain filling it with a constant whisper, and he understood that she was making the most important decision of her life based on nothing more than instinct and exhaustion. In that moment, memories he had buried rose up uninvited. A younger version of himself, hungry, holding his mother's hand as she begged for help from people who looked away, the promise he had made to himself that if he ever escaped that life, he would never be weak again. Yet here he was, realizing that strength without compassion was just another kind of emptiness. Elena's shoulders finally lowered a fraction, the smallest surrender, and she nodded once, slowly. Relief and responsibility crashed into him at the same time, heavier than any deal he had ever closed. As he opened the car door for her, shielding the babies from the rain, he felt the night shift around them, as if the road itself had witnessed a choice that could not be undone. The inside of the car felt like another world, sealed off from the rain and darkness, and as warm air filled the space, Elena's rigid posture did not soften the way he had expected, because safety, he realized, was not something that arrived all at once, but something that had to be proven again and again. She sat on the back seat, clutching the four babies close to her chest, her eyes constantly moving, tracking every sound, every small shift of his body, as if she were prepared to flee even now. He adjusted the temperature carefully, afraid of doing anything sudden, and placed a bottle of water and a packet of tissues beside her without making a show of it. The engine hummed softly as he pulled back onto the road, driving slower than usual, the city lights streaking across the wet windshield like uncertain promises. The babies stirred, making tiny, breathy noises, and each sound went straight through him, awakening something tender and unfamiliar. He asked if they needed milk, heat, a doctor, his questions practical and quiet, and she answered in short sentences, giving only what was necessary, as though too many words might invite trouble. She explained they were only a few months old, born early, that she had learned how to feed and calm them in ways that let her keep all four safe at once, a skill earned through countless sleepless nights. As they drove, the silence grew less threatening, filled instead with the soft rhythm of breathing and rain tapping on the roof, and he felt a strange responsibility settle on him, not the kind enforced by law or reputation, but the kind that comes from being seen at someone's most vulnerable moment. He chose a small, discreet hotel on the edge of the city, not the luxury towers where his name would open doors too loudly, and inside, the staff responded instantly to his calm authority, bringing towels, warm water, extra blankets without asking questions. Elena followed him through the lobby like a shadow, every muscle tense, and when they reached the room, she hesitated at the door, clearly expecting some condition to be revealed at last. He stepped aside, letting her enter first, making sure she understood that this space was hers. Inside, he spread clean blankets on the bed, careful and methodical, then placed the babies gently down, one by one, as she guided him with whispered instructions, her trust growing not through words but through shared action. The room was quiet except for the hum of the heater, and he noticed how her hands shook as the immediate danger faded, how exhaustion rushed in to take its place. She finally asked the question that had been waiting since the road, her voice low and steady despite everything, asking why he was doing this, what he wanted in return. He met her gaze and told her the truth as simply as he could, that he had more than enough of everything except a reason that felt real, that seeing her standing there with four children and no one stopping had reminded him of how easily people disappear when they need help most. He spoke of nothing heroic, made no promises of miracles, only said that leaving her on that road would have stayed with him in a way he did not want to carry. She listened, not softened, but less guarded, as if weighing the sincerity in his tone rather than the logic of his explanation. As the babies finally slept, curled together like they shared a single heartbeat, he pulled a chair near the door and sat down, making a point of not approaching the bed again, of placing himself in a position that signaled respect more clearly than reassurance ever could. In the quiet, his thoughts drifted backward, to nights when he himself had been hungry and afraid, when his mother had tried to hide her worry behind forced smiles, and he wondered how many times she had prayed for someone like the man he was now. He realized with a tightness in his chest that wealth had not erased those memories. It had only buried them under layers of comfort. When he finally stood to leave her alone, telling her he would return in the morning, Elena locked the door behind him with deliberate care and leaned against it, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor. The tears came then, silently, not from fear, but from the crushing release of being able to rest for the first time in months without listening for footsteps or sirens. And in the hallway outside, he paused, aware that something fundamental had shifted, not just in her life, but in his own. Morning arrived gently, filtered through pale curtains and the steady hum of traffic far below. And when he returned to the hotel with bags of food, clean clothes, and supplies for infants, he felt a nervousness he rarely experienced in boardrooms or negotiations, because this time the outcome mattered in a way he could not control with money alone. Elena opened the door only after checking through the peephole, the chain still in place as she studied his face, and when she finally let him in, he noticed how different she looked in daylight, younger and more fragile, the shadows under her eyes deeper now that the adrenaline of the night before had faded. The babies were awake, for small lives filling the room with soft sounds, and as he set the bags down, he kept his movements slow and predictable, aware that trust, once broken, could not be bought back. He had arranged for a social worker to come later in the morning, someone experienced, discreet, and compassionate, but when he mentioned it, Elena's body tensed instantly, fear flashing across her face like a reflex. He raised his hands again, the same gesture from the road, and explained carefully that no one was there to take her children away, that the woman coming was there to offer choices, not ultimatums. The word choice seemed to matter, and Elena listened as he spoke about temporary housing, medical care for the babies, legal assistance to help her navigate systems designed without people like her in mind. As the conversation unfolded, pieces of her story began to surface, not all at once, but in fragments, as if speaking it required her to relive it. She talked about her husband, gone suddenly in an accident that left her stunned and unprepared, about family members who had offered sympathy but not support, about jobs that disappeared the moment employers realized she came with four infants and no flexibility. She spoke without bitterness, but with a quiet resignation that unsettled him more than anger would have. He watched her as she fed the babies, the practiced efficiency of her movements revealing how quickly love had turned into survival, and he wondered how many times she had been forced to choose between pride and necessity. When the social worker arrived, her manner calm and unthreatening, the room filled with a cautious professionalism that seemed to put Elena slightly more at ease. Papers were explained slowly, questions answered without pressure, and for the first time in months, Elena was not being told what she must do, but what she could do. He stayed mostly silent, allowing her to lead the conversation, stepping in only to clarify details or offer reassurance when fear threatened to shut her down. By midday, plans had begun to take shape, modest but real, a small apartment available through a community program, follow-up medical appointments, childcare support that acknowledged the reality of four babies instead of pretending one-size solutions would work. Elena's expression shifted subtly as the hours passed, the tightness around her eyes easing just enough to suggest hope, fragile but alive. When she finally looked at him and said, "Thank you," not as a reflex, but as a conscious choice, he felt an unexpected weight in his chest, the kind that comes from realizing how close someone has been to falling through cracks he had never noticed before. He brushed off her gratitude, insisting that none of this was extraordinary, that it was simply what should have happened long ago, though even as he said it, he knew how rare such moments actually were. Reporters called him repeatedly that day about an unrelated business acquisition, their voices insistent and demanding, but he let the calls go unanswered, his priorities quietly rearranging themselves without a formal decision. As the afternoon light shifted and the babies slept again, he stood by the window, watching the city move on below, and understood that for all his influence and wealth, the most meaningful thing he had done in years was not something that would ever appear in a headline. When he finally prepared to leave, promising to check in but not intrude, Elena walked him to the door, her posture straighter than before, her gaze steadier. After he left, she sat on the bed surrounded by her children, the room suddenly too quiet, and for the first time since her life had collapsed, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond the next hour. While somewhere down the hall, he paused, aware that this was only the beginning of a responsibility he could no longer ignore. Weeks passed quietly, not marked by dramatic gestures or sudden transformations, but by small, steady changes that accumulated into something meaningful, and the road where they had first met became a fixed point in his memory, a reminder of how close despair and hope can stand without ever touching unless someone chooses to bridge the space. Elena moved into a modest apartment filled with light, the kind of place she once would have walked past without imagining it could ever be hers. And as boxes were unpacked and furniture arranged, the chaos of her life began to settle into a fragile rhythm shaped by feeding schedules, doctor visits, and the growing, distinct personalities of four babies who no longer felt like a single, overwhelming weight. He visited sparingly, always calling ahead, always arriving with the same quiet respect he had shown that first night, understanding that help could easily become another form of control if he was not careful. When he did come, it was often with practical things rather than grand gifts, groceries, diapers, a repaired heater, listening more than speaking, and he learned to recognize the difference between what money could fix and what only time and dignity could heal. Elena grew more confident with each passing week, her movements less frantic, her smile appearing more often, and one evening, as the babies lay on a blanket watching the world with wide, curious eyes, she finally spoke about the night on the road without her voice shaking. She told him how she had stood there in the rain, convinced that kindness was something reserved for stories told to comfort children, how his words had sounded almost unbelievable, and yet how she had chosen to trust them because she had nothing left to lose. He listened without interrupting, aware that the true weight of that moment had belonged to her, not to him. And when she finished, there was a silence filled with understanding rather than uncertainty. As he prepared to leave, she stopped him, not to ask for anything, but to say that one sentence, spoken without promises or conditions, had changed the direction of 5 lives, and the realization humbled him more deeply than any praise he had ever received. Driving away that night, the city lights reflected off the windshield, and he found himself slowing as he approached the stretch of road where everything had begun, memories rising unbidden of rain, fear, and a choice made without knowing the outcome. He understood then that wealth had never been the source of his power in that moment. It had only given him the freedom to act on something far older and more human, the ability to see suffering and refuse to look away. In the months that followed, his world continued to demand decisions, deals, and attention, but something fundamental had shifted in how he measured success, no longer in numbers alone, but in the quiet knowledge that someone else's life had been steadied because he had stopped. Elena, now surrounded by a small but growing network of support, began taking steps toward work that fit her reality, her confidence rebuilding piece by piece as she proved to herself that she was more than the sum of her hardships. The babies grew stronger, their laughter filling rooms that once echoed with fear, and each milestone felt like a shared victory, though he remained careful to stay in the background, letting their story belong to them. One evening, alone on his balcony, he reflected on how close he had come to driving past that night, how easily he could have chosen comfort over conscience, and the thought unsettled him more than any risk he had ever taken. He realized that the world had not changed in some grand, sweeping way. Injustice and indifference still existed, but for 5 people, the direction had shifted enough to matter. And in that understanding, he found a sense of purpose that no amount of wealth had ever provided, a quiet, enduring truth that stayed with him long after the rain had washed the road clean.